Welcome on in, everybody. It is Thursday. It's noon. It's caucus time, and I got a guest today. Well, he's not really a guest. You are truly the only guest host because you're technically a guest now. You're not a regular, but you used to host for months and months and months. I guess Mason has outpaced you at this point, but Mr. Andrew Muller is on with us today. Mason is out. He's got some family stuff going on, but there's a big topic I wanted to dive into, and Andrew is the man to talk to us about that. So I'm glad that you could join me today, Andrew. Thank you for being here.
Wow, it's a pleasure, Ryan. Glad to be back in the saddle at Unauthorized Caucus.
Yeah, we made a few changes around here since you've been gone. Really, because you've been. No, I'm kidding. Not because you've been gone, but we've had a lot of good stuff going on, folks. Let me remind you off the bat, we'll dive into our topic here today, but go to unauthorizedcaucus.com. That's where you'll sign up for the email list. That's where you can make sure you're getting all the notifications. You'll find the Rumble channel, any of the socials. Make sure you subscribe there. Again, this goes out on Thursdays at noon Central Time as a live stream. Podcast goes out on Friday, or if it's last week, the podcast goes out over the weekend. It depends on what happens, but it's always going to be weekly. And then, of course, let me remind you, head over to trexinc.com, our wonderful sponsors. We appreciate them so very much. Go show them. Well, make sure you get on in there and give them some love. I got them on the screen there a little bit so you could see them. I didn't have one of my audio setups set. I told you, Andrew, we've changed things around here. But go over there, Caucus 30, great big promo code, gets you a great big promotional deal, and then it lets them know that we sent you. Say thank you for sponsoring The Reckoning. We appreciate them, or The Reckoning, the Unauthorized Caucus. There's too many shows, folks. There's too many shows. So it is shameless cross. It's called cross pollination in the business, and that's what an accident sounds like. But yeah, that's the biggie. Well, Andrew, today there's a lot to talk about. You and Mr. Alex Newman were up in New York City last week causing trouble at the United Nations. You only got arrested a couple of times, I saw. You're fine. Thank you for the New American for bailing you out. No, I'm kidding. No arresting, although that could happen up there with journalists. But you went up for the Summit of the Future, at the end of which we, along with several other nations, signed the Pact for the Future. And this, well, we all know as conservatives, the UN is kind of the big baddie of globalism. But then there's also the World Economic Forum, but there's also this. And as all of these things just entangle more and more, we get stuck into a whole world of problems. And they're not treaties, but my goodness, if we don't end up getting just stuck with stuff. Give me an overview. What was the Summit of the Future? What was the UN's stated goals? And then let's maybe dive in from there. What exactly it is going to end up meaning for us? Because as with any UN thing, I can only imagine this just has tentacles in about every possible thing that the United States could think of that we would do at a federal level. What was it?
never going to eradicate hunger. You're never going to eliminate carbon, right? It's just impossible. These are things that aren't attainable. But they want to do it, and they want to do it in the next, 6 years. So they're desperate, knowing they're not meeting their goals. So the Summit of the Future, according to the Pact for the Future and the UN leaders, was an effort to, quote, turbocharge the Sustainable Development Goals. They wanted to quote, as Antonio Guterres, who's kind of like the president of the UN, the Secretary General is his title. He opened his remarks by saying, we're bringing globalism, multilateralism back from the brink. So they recognize we're failing in meeting our deadlines. We're failing in meeting our goals. So to turbocharge this, we're going to have a sub-event called the Summit of the Future. And in that, we're going to try to dump gas on the fire to get these SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, back on track to be accomplished by the year 2030. So through doing that, they passed the Pact for the Future, which we can get into. It's a 50-plus page document. And they laid out a whole bunch of objectives, a whole bunch of plans to turbocharge their efforts to achieve these Sustainable Development Goals. And spoiler alert, it's more power to the UN. It's more power to the Secretary General of the UN, and controlling information, which we can get into. So it was very interesting to observe. We learned a lot, but hardly any American media is covering this. And people debate, is this legally binding to the U.S.? Is, this like a treaty? Is it like an agreement? And there's a lot of people we've talked to, experts on multiple sides of the spectrum, and they all have different takes. But no matter what it is, these sort of summits, these sort of agreements end up shaping the deep state's goals and their objectives. So when you think of the deep state in America, the Biden administration, these maskless figures who are pushing, Kamala Harris right now, they really believe in this pact. They really believe in what the UN's all about. So even if it's not legally binding, which is debatable to begin with, it's binding in so much as the people who run the shadow government in our country are pushing these agenda items and believe in it. So if it's legally binding or not, it still affects us because this is what the bureaucracy, the oligarchy cares about.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the primary points that I believe people are starting to realize when it comes to the UN, because this really has almost just been like crazy conspiracy land for the last several decades. I mean, it's not been inside, I would say, the mainstream of American conservatism. Yeah, we don't like the UN, but really getting into it, talking about Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030 and running down the list. This was something you would find at a Phyllis Schlafly conference, at a John Birch Society conference, like the stalwart conservatives. And I know some people would get mad that I threw those two in the same sentence. Guess what? John Birch Society has been top-notch right on pretty much everything since the inception of JBS. There, I said it, and I'm right. But come at me. Isn't that what the people say on the internet now? Come at me, bro. Right. And even there, bro, there's, not accounting for the other 100 and whatever genders. But right. This is one of those that you look at and say, we've all kind of come to realize now, it doesn't matter if there's a legally binding treaty. What we're dealing with is a permanent state that is basically telling you out loud their goals, what they're moving toward. You get to go and see it at the UN. It's just that so many people aren't paying attention to it. You have to, I wonder what the deep state is doing. We know what they're doing. They literally tell you out loud through the UN agendas, through what they're doing at the conferences there, that's the direction they're going to move. And it doesn't matter if it's legally binding with good air quotes, or a treaty that the Senate ratified, another good set of air quotes. It is, in fact, the direction that they're going to move, this permanent bureaucratic state here in the United States of America. So you touched on several, and I was looking over everything here ahead of time. I want to ask you about a few specific things because, of course, I heard you say the word Sustainable Development Goals. This is one of our least favorite phrases to hear because sustainable development is essentially, I hear then Klaus Schwab's voice in my head, right, that you will eat crickets and sterilize yourself and like it. You will enjoy it. It's just, it has to happen in Klaus Schwab's voice. But looking at this Agenda 2030, I think it's been on everyone's radar. They've heard that phrase, but it sounds like with this meeting, we actually are seeing a potential acceleration of what they want to do. And here's my question to you. So if this is this expansion meeting, I heard it referred to as the UN 2.0 and a couple of other things. Looking at the election this year in the United States of America, I know that, well, I guess looking at Donald Trump's first term and a prospective second term, let me phrase it like that. If he is actually going to come in and do some serious damage to the permanent administrative state here in America. That's going to cause damage to this US funding of and adherence
Right.
to some of these things like the Pact for the Future. What
Okay.
do you see in terms of an acceleration of the UN agendas and this Agenda 2030 sustainable development? What do you see in terms of an acceleration because of a prospective second term for Donald Trump, which I think is going to happen? The question is, do they think it's going to happen, and do you see them behaving differently? Again, you and Alex have put your heads all the way into this issue to start wrapping around it and understand. Do you see a fear there, kind of like we're starting to see in this deep state here in the U.S.? Oh my gosh, if this guy gets in and it looks like he's gonna do some damage to what we're doing here.
Yeah. Before I address that, I want to add one thing, and I have a lot to say on that, so I'll get to it.
Well,
But
good,
like
we got a
going
while
back
here.
briefly, yeah, going back briefly to the, does this have legal binding? Does this really affect us? Kind of think about it like this too. Imagine if you were on, like a board, like a committee. Let's just use, for example, I'm coming up with this off the top of my head, but like a subdivision board, okay, like a HOA, right? And you guys had a meeting, and you came up with a memo, and maybe that memo, described here are 10 things we want to do in our subdivision over the next 5 years. And it doesn't necessarily spell out legislatively like this is how we're going to spend the money. Here's what individual's going to do what, but it's basically just a listing of what we want to accomplish over the next few years. That then becomes the marching orders for all the various houses in the subdivision to enact. And they can do that under different banners, they can do that under different names. But, like, for example, one of the biggest SDGs that they push, one of the biggest sustainable development goals is the climate action thing. When the US passed the US Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which was really a climate change bill, that's ultimately what it ended up being. That was perfectly aligned with what the UN SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal on climate, wanted. That bill was directly informed by the same ideology and the same people who work at the UN. It didn't mention anything about the UN. It didn't mention anything about the Sustainable Development Goals at all. But it was perfectly in line with moving the football towards the touchdown line for the Sustainable Development Goals. So when the UN goes and these 193 member countries agree upon something like the Pact for the Future, they take those ideologies, those commitments, those goals back to their nations, and then they try to execute them through various legislative means under different banners and different names. So when we see all these climate bills happening in the US, when we see all of these things like the Inflation Reduction Act, the Paris Climate Agreement that Obama was involved in, all that kind of stuff, that's UN influenced in part actions by the United States government. They maybe don't label it and have the UN logo behind them and put the UN in the title, but that's where they're getting the ideas. And my proof of that is we fund 1/3 of the UN. If we're the American taxpayer money is going towards that. So obviously there's some sort of invested interest, some level of commitment to executing these things. It's not just purely ceremonious. So it definitely bleeds into it. So you just need to be on guard. And I think most Americans really need to read what these 17 goals are and know what they are, because when you see legislation that comes out of the U.S. Congress and it touches on these various things, we need to think, oh, wait, what's the UN's involvement in this? Because I can guarantee you there is some level. Now, going to Trump, I think that it's really obvious that the United Nations is preparing and battening down the hatches for a second Trump administration. We talked to a handful of folks who were there on the ground, and I won't share their names or anything. They weren't elected officials or anything, but they were people who were heavily involved in the UN. Some of them were from NGOs, some of them were from private companies, and they come to the UN and they have involvement in attaining the SDGs and culture and in business and things like that. And we talked to a handful of those people, in part because they were some of the most accessible individuals, because the UN was so tyrannical about getting the press near any sort of dictators or foreign leaders. But the consensus was overwhelming that if Donald Trump gets back into the office, we are going to be in big trouble here at the United Nations. One individual we talked to, we even said, what would you recommend the UN to do if Donald Trump was elected? And she said, quote, come back and do a summit of the future stronger than this one. They are convinced that if Donald Trump is elected, that they are going to be in big trouble. And one of my proofs for that is the Council on Foreign Relations. the CFR. You can kind of think of this as really the United States headquarters.
And if I may interject, you said it, so we have to have the boo. I don't have that sound effect queued up, but you said CFR, so I have to obligatorily boo. Sorry, go ahead.
And we have so many United States representatives and United States politicians involved in this CFR. It's unbelievable. That's a whole nother conversation. But the CFR actually has on their website right now. You can look at this up and you'll see it. They say this about Donald Trump and the UN, quote, UN agencies, programs, and missions receive critical funding from the United States. The Trump administration sharply reduced funding to some UN agencies, but President Biden has largely reversed those cuts. The United States remains the largest donor to the United Nations. Remember, 1/3 of the whole funding out of 193 member countries. It contributed more than $18 billion in 2022, accounting for 1/3 of the funding for the body's collective budget. Despite President Donald Trump's efforts to cut funding, President Joe Biden has affirmed the United Nations' importance to U.S. foreign policy and increased funding to the organization. So they have that live on their website right now. To me, that smells of pure desperation, recognizing that they're in big trouble if Donald Trump gets elected again. And we have to remember, Ryan, 6 years ago, about a week ago, Donald Trump said to the UN this quote, which I think is extraordinarily powerful. He said, quote, America will always choose independence and cooperation over global governance, control, and domination. Trump said that in the UN headquarters, okay? That's like going into a rat hole in your backyard and saying, you guys are going to get smoked out and poisoned and eradicated from my yard. We will not stand for this. I mean, it's going right into the belly of the beast and dumping cold water on their face. That sentiment still resonates at the United Nations. Biden came and spoke at the Summit of the Future. It was proving everything they did. No dissent, no nothing. It was all approval. So I think that if you're the UN right now, and this is just purely my opinion, you're not preparing for how to subvert Donald Trump's election. You're not preparing to rig on November 5th. You're preparing a crisis event, whether that be a nuclear war, whether that be a online cyber pandemic, as Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum has said. And a cyber pandemic is really just like a grid failure, something like that, a massive internet failure, a massive data loss, data breach, whatever, cyber pandemic, or some sort of an economic crisis, whether that be the overthrowing of the US dollar and the replacement of it with a digital currency, whether that be some sort of a recession, whether that be some sort of massive labor strike, you pick whatever. It doesn't really matter what the crisis is. But I think the UN's preparing to subvert a second Trump administration. And the reason I think that's an advantageous strategy for them is that if you steal the election from Trump again, it doesn't kill MAGA, it emboldens it. It now gives his supporters more anger, more frustration that the system's rigged against them, and they will backlash in ways that I don't even know what that would look like. If Trump wins, they get to re-legitimize the institutions and say, look, the elections aren't rigged. Your guy won. The elections are safe. Trump beat Kamala. And they can have that reassurance. Maybe a few months go by, maybe even a year, insert crisis. And then they can say, look, you guys had your way. National sovereignty had its day in court. America First had its opportunity. And this is what it got us. This is where it took us. This is what Donald Trump and his followers want for the world. And then they can blame it on the movement. There can be discrediting. There can be re-education of the public. There can be mass censorship, whatever. But that crisis can be blamed on us. And I think that that is the ultimate tactic of these people. I think that's what they're looking forward to, because it takes down Trump and it takes down the movement. And I think the linchpin to make that happen is information. And we can get into that as well. But I think that's really the play.
Wait a minute. Pause. You just dropped something that I haven't thought of, and I don't know if many other people have thought of, because I think that the entirety of, we'll just say not the right wing, the entirety of the conservative movement, the people who, whether they're full blown make America great again or not, if they're just good old America first people, but they're hesitant of Trump, whatever it is, all of those people, I would tend to say, not all of the right, which is now very big in its definition, but everyone in that camp is hyper focused, I would say, on one of two things: an event that changes the election, theft, fraud, election fraud, or they're focused on, which is honestly where I've been. Nah, I don't think it's fraud so much. I think that they're going to cheat like they always cheat. They might not be able to overcome him like they did in 2020, but what I'm really worried about is 2025. What's going to happen in January of 2025? We've already seen one Fedsurrection where they messed with an event and fomented problems, and now they've been weaponized. They've weaponized their own Department of Justice against people. What are they willing to do if they were willing to do that? What are they willing to do now to ensure Trump doesn't take office? But you're talking about, and I want to reiterate this for everyone listening, you're talking about the possibility of, no, we let them all in. We let Trump into office. We let them have their day. And then 6 months or whatever into a Trump administration, we're going to bring about some sort of cataclysmic failure, some sort of pandemic collapse, whatever it is, that we can hang the whole thing on their neck and not only get him out of office and destroy him, but we can destroy the movement itself. Because if we do it before then, they're just going to know, and it's going to make them madder. Is that, right? Am I repeating correctly what you're saying, what you think it is?
Yes. Yes, it is, Ryan. And I think that was what COVID was at first. I think that COVID was also an effort to derail Trump. But what stopped that from reaching its full intended end, my speculation, is alternative media. People like you and me and the New American and the Epic Times and places like Rumble and X and all these different platforms came together, and people started to find information. They started to find, like, think of the Dr. Robert Malone's, think of the Peter McCullough's, think of the Frontline Doctors, think of maybe that newsletter you subscribed to that gave you information on what was going on with the vaccines. Whatever it may be, people, a large part of the population, turned away from mainstream media. They turned away from the narrative, and they started to look elsewhere for information. And the World Health Organization, which I think people forget, is the health arm of the United Nations. They're tethered together. The WHO is the UN. They labeled this, and they have the page on their website right now. You can Google it. What they called an infodemic. And they said one of the worst parts of COVID was the information pandemic. And they call it an infodemic. And really what that was people stopped listening to the National Institute of Health, NIH, Dr. Fauci from the NIH, the Center for Disease Control, the WHO. Those things started to lose credibility, and those alternative platforms that I mentioned were replacing them. What they're talking about now, and this is in the Pact for the Future, and we can read quotes and talk about it, is preparing an information ecosystem, which is the phrase they use, which I think is a fascinating phrase. They want to clear that information ecosystem of toxins. And I'm quoting from the UN. These are the actual words they've used. And they want to prepare the internet and the algorithms for the next crisis. And you might think that I'm being crazy. I will read to you a part of what the Pact for the Future says regarding a crisis. Here, I'll pull it up. The UN described this ambition in the Pact, and they committed to this, quote, promoting access to relevant, reliable, and accurate information in crisis systems to protect and empower those in vulnerable situations. And then they say to achieve this, what they want to do to help set up the internet for a crisis situation is call on technology and social media companies to, quote, enhance content moderation, recommendation algorithms, and to do that to, quote, help individuals make informed choices. How they've done that is by partnering with companies like Google, by partnering with companies like Facebook to put UN, WHO, National Institute of Health, CDC content at the top of your algorithm. So when you go on the internet, maybe 10 years ago, you would type in vaccines, right? And you might get information from, blogs. You might get information from alternative independent media. You might get information from government. Now, if you type in vaccines, you type in climate change, you type in immigration, or even if you type in certain events in history, like 9/11, for example, you're going to get government resources at the top of your page. You're going to get NASA, CDC, NIH, the UN, Department of Homeland Security, whatever the topic may be in the relevant authority on a given topic, that's going to be at the top of the search engine. That's not because that's what the free market of ideas has selected as the best choice. That's what Google and these companies, through a corrupt merger of state and media power, have orchestrated. And what I estimate, Ryan, just this is my opinion, is that what they're doing right now with the UN, creating these clean information ecosystems, talking about crisis information, scenarios where they're going to partner with all these companies to prepare for the next crisis, prepare for the content to be approved for informed decisions of the users during the next event, is really a battening down the hatches to make sure what happened with COVID doesn't happen again. Because if, let's say, there's a cyber pandemic, that's kind of a difficult one because then no one would have access to the internet. But let's say Iran tries to nuke the United States. Let's just say that hypothetically. Iran tries to nuke the United States. If that happened, and maybe the US had some sort of a nefarious role in that, and all of the dissented voices were eradicated from the internet, the only narrative that we would get is the lapdog media coverage of whatever the United States wanted the people of this country to hear and believe. That makes us easy to manipulate. And John Kerry, and we talked about this on your radio show, Ryan, John Kerry was talking about this at the World Economic Forum just a few weeks ago. He talked about how consensus is hard to build these days because we don't have the referees that we had 45, 50 years ago. What he's talking about is we don't have the iron grip on media that we used to have during like JFK. When JFK was assassinated, you had like NBC, you had Time Magazine, you had you had the New York Times, you had a few other media outlets on TV, but they were all in bed with the CIA, the federal government, through things like Operation Mockingbird, and people can look that up and get into it. But there was no Epic Times, there was no Unauthorized Caucus, there was no Substack, there was no alternative option. So they were very easily able to build consensus. Everyone would watch the news. Maybe you listen to one of three sources. Doesn't matter which source you listen to. They're all saying the same variation of the same agenda. And then, you could easily control the public. Now, that's no longer an option because of the internet. So what John Kerry, the World Economic Forum, the UN are trying to do is they're trying to cleanse this information ecosystem. They're trying to watertight the ship so that when the storm comes, the next event happens, they want to blame it on Trump. They want to blame it on America first. There's nobody blowing the whistle. There's nobody being the watchdog. And that will allow them to gain control using fear, using the crisis, using the nuclear threat, the cyber pandemic, whatever it is. They will be able to control the people through fear and manipulation. And everybody else will be labeled a conspiracy theorist, unpatriotic. How dare you not want to go to war with Iran? They've attacked us, blah, 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 whatever the situation may be. And then they can lead the American people into a globalist-like situation. So that is what I think is happening. My evidence for that is just this emphatic obsession from the UN to control online internet. And Alex and I actually, this has maybe been said one or two places, but I can say it. Alex and I received a leaked memo from an internal UN employee. And the UN was saying in the memo that they wanted to take control of the internet, that they wanted to obtain the internet and push their narrative because it's become a problematic tool that undermines and erodes their credibility. So this is where they're at right now. It's controlling the narrative so that when the next crisis happens, they can tell you what to do, even though they're the people that you need to be going against and pushing back. So I think that's really where we're at.
Well, and I think that this is an incredibly important dovetail into something that we already know. We've watched and seen, the World Economic Forum the last 3 or 4 years. I haven't seen the UN in news headlines as much. And of course, this is all alternative media. CNN's not covering it, that's for sure. If they did, it's just breathlessness of I don't know, feigning and fainting and fanning and everything, all of the everythings over the world leaders. But what we saw in alternative media was the shift in the World Economic Forum, Davos crowd talking about, the next thing that's coming is not a global health crisis. It's a global information crisis, misinformation or disinformation. This is the next frontier that we must face. And you see that and say, oh my gosh, they're coming for it. They know what killed them in the last pandemic. It really was, I think, to your point, alternative media because now you and I know not only platforms that didn't exist in 2019, media itself has become easier to do. Heck, that's what led to the rise of things like Unauthorized Caucus, and that's what led to the amplification of places like Liberty Sentinel and the New American and Phyllis Schlafly Eagles, where I am. In 2020, everyone turned to their screens. Technology, thank you, free markets, adapted, and all of a sudden you can make higher quality content than ever before for a lot cheaper and a lot less investment in knowledge. Well, that, I think, to your point, I agree with you. That helped to tamp down COVID in a way that they did not expect. And now I guess I've said that word a couple of times, so YouTube's going to cut us. We'll double check. Are we still streaming on YouTube? We'll double check that. But there's my plug, Rumble. Get on Rumble and make sure you're following us. If you're on X or YouTube, go find us now on Rumble and subscribe. But this now we're seeing the enforcement arm, essentially the actual practical enforcement arm coming forward of what we heard discussed at the World Economic Forum, that misinformation is the next one. Well, what are you going to do about it? Enter the United Nations and this Pact for the Future. By the way, I put that document, the big Pact for the Future with all of the goodies you were reading from it. I put that actual PDF document down in the chat of wherever it is. If you're YouTube, Rumble X, wherever you're listening, you can click on it and go and search for what Andrew was talking about, or read the whole thing for yourself. I'll make sure, if you're subscribed, this is my mid podcast reminder, go and subscribe, because we're going to have notes tomorrow. And there's going to be a lot of reading material that you want to get a hold of. That'll be in the notes that we send out tomorrow. But this strikes me as, the big worry that we all have. The World Economic Forum, the globalist elite. We'll just say the global elites are coming for misinformation and disinformation next. Where is that coming? When's it happening? What does it look like? It sounds like this month up in New York City, we got a real glimpse as to that, the war plan for that. What's actually going to happen, how they're going to come at it. And it makes me wonder, did you get a sense from hanging out there and hearing things, which of course I must ask, just on a nuts and bolts level, I've been to the UN before, right, and it's not the easiest place to waltz around in. Now, when I went, it was, we're talking nearly 20 years ago now, between 15 and 20 years ago. You could sneak through doors and past guards if you flipped your badge around and walked behind a delegation of people from a certain nation and looked like you knew what you were doing and you looked like them. That kind of needed to be a factor. Imagine that. The UN security guards profiled you based on the color of your skin. How dare they? But rules for them, rules for us and not for them. But you could sneak through things. Now, I've heard it's a whole different world. And what you all described was that now it was even worse. You had escorts and couldn't go anywhere on property without a multitude of escorts. Did I get that correct?
That's correct, Ryan. So Alex Newman, who went with me, he's been going to these for 15 years. So he's been to the UN in far more dictatorial nations than the United States, right? And you think it'd be worse over there. He said it's actually better than it was here. And what really happened was the press, like if you think about like a rectangle, right? Think of like the campus of the UN, like a rectangle like this, okay? The facilities, the headquarters where they meet, the buildings, the General Assembly Hall, all of that stuff's over here. Then they have this really nice garden that's actually quite vast. They have this garden over on the north end of the campus. And there they have what they called the media tent. Excuse me. And the media tent was a semi-permanent structure set up, had about 15 to 20 very large flat screen TVs on the inside, little snack booth, outlets, Wi-Fi, all that kind of stuff. And that's where they wanted the press to stay. This is what shocked me the most. Everyone who was there was accredited press. You had to have an actual media company that had a brick and mortar facility, that had a website, that had a letterhead, all that stuff. Just to apply, you had to have a letter from your editor-in-chief assigning you to go there that was sent to the UN. You had to, provide a passport, all of this, TSA plus level security. Then you had to go to another facility in New York City to get this badge. I've got mine right here, press pass, that you had to wear at all times. You had to go through bomb sniffing dogs. You had to go through all of this crazy stuff just to even get in the facility. So no one was there that's like a Facebook mom journalist. No one was there that was like some random guy off the street with his iPhone who's live streaming on Facebook. All of these people were legitimate, accredited, institutionalized journalists. And a part of that problem that resulted out of that was most of them were state-funded media. because a lot of the great people who do reporting on this, they don't have a brick and mortar facility where their news outlet is housed. They
Right.
don't have an editor in chief who can give them a letter assignment. They don't have a plethora of articles to send to the UN to prove that they've been reporting on these topics for decades, which is a part of the criteria. So they really just, even on entry, are very discriminatory towards who can come and who can't to the UN. So as a result of that, once we got in there and we started to look around, we recognized most of the press here, which I'd estimate is probably about 200 to 300 press members total, were from foreign nations, mainly Pakistan, China, Middle Eastern countries, a few from some of the more liberal, European nations like England and, even Sweden and Switzerland had some representation, stuff like that there. But from what we could tell, we were among maybe 10 members of the American press.
Wow.
So out of 200 to 300 people, there are about 10 members of the American media there. And the only two outlets I recognized that I saw and thought that's American media was the Associated Press and a local like NBC New York affiliate. And we went and looked at what they published or what they put out as a result of their attendance at the UN. And they were very vague, if not very encouraging and approving summarizations of what happened. They didn't talk about any of the controversial elements. They didn't criticize it at all, of course. And a few other American outlets that weren't there put out stuff. One of my favorites was Forbes. They put out an article, one of their only articles they put out that covered it. And they said 5 reasons why you need to care about the United Nations Summit of the Future. And one of their first points was that was going to help improve everyone's lives, which is a very basic and kind of dumb reason you should care. It's going to improve your life, So total lapdog media coverage. So we get in and everyone's staying at the media tent. And we're like, well, there's no interviews to be had. There's no scoops to be obtained at the media tent. Why do we want to stay here? They're broadcasting UN TV, which is a live stream available on YouTube that I could get on my couch right now. So there's no exclusive coverage going on in the media tent. So we're like, we're going to leave and go to where the action's happening, near the General Assembly Hall, near the meeting facilities. So we're immediately met with UN police. You guys can't go there. You have a P on your pass. You need to have a D for delegate or an M for missions or something else. Press is not allowed here. So after finagling and getting around and trying to figure out what in the world's going on, we recognized that you needed an escort to go to secure areas. So we're like, okay, we'll go get an escort. So we go to the MALU office, which is the UN Media Accreditation Liaison Unit. And we go up there and we say, hey, we'd like an escort to go and report on what's going on, hopefully get some interviews. Met with immediate pushback. Why do you want to do that? What are you trying to learn? Where do you want to go? Who do you want to talk to? Why do you want to do that? Don't you know where the media tent is? And that was my favorite part. They always gave us the directions back to the media tent. So we finally got this girl who was about, we finally got this girl who was about 20, 25 years old. She was from Hong Kong. She was Chinese, broken English. She was an intern. So we stopped her and we said, hey, can you help us find a place where we could get some interviews? And we said, we heard there's a press briefing room, but no one's told us how to get there. No one from the media knows how to get there. There's no maps. There's no information, which is all by design. So she's like, oh yeah, I can take you there. So we found out the room was S237. Now there's multiple buildings. There's multiple facilities. What building is S237 in? Well, they wouldn't tell you that. It's just S237. So this poor girl, I think out of ignorance, she's looking at S237 on her phone, and she just takes the 2 and the 7 and goes to the UN main facility building, which is the big skyscraper on UN campus, totally closed off to the public, and takes us to the 27th floor. Well, that's where the offices are and the bigwigs and the titled folks live and reside. So we get up this elevator, glass elevator, UN logo, no members of the press, all suited individuals. They're not wearing IDs or tags. They're UN employees, higher ups, going to their offices, listening to people talking in the elevators. They're talking about peacekeeper troops. They're talking about meetings, briefings, etc. We know we're not supposed to be there. Elevator doors open. Now there's not the normal UN police that's downstairs on the ground. It's the official ceremonial guard, the UN. They've got the yellow tasseled shoulder embellishments. They've got the hats, the shined shoes. They're standing at guard. We're like, yikes, we don't think we're supposed to be here. They see the P on our press pass, the ceremonial guards. They freak out. They swarm us. They start investigating our camera gear. One of them starts rapidly clicking the elevator button. We go back down. Waiting for us at the bottom of the elevator is a much senior Chinese UN official who got word that somehow this intern took us all the way up to the 27th floor. She questions us like we're in a gulag in Russia. How did you get here? What are your intentions? What are you trying to accomplish? We defer to our intern and say she took us here. She won't believe that story. She says that's not true. She wouldn't do that. No one would take you there. Starts questioning us, takes us out of the building. And as we're going past the building, there's all this Soviet Marxist art. And this Soviet Marxist art is extraordinarily telling of the UN's ideology. It's these very depressing looking people, some of them dead, bodies on the floor, skeletons with like machinery sticking out of them. And they're pulling away the earth and rebuilding this steel globe, the steel world. And at the top, there's this four-armed man. And you can go to my X account, and I've got this art shared on there. There's this four-armed man placing the UN logo on the top of this newly erected earth. And I'm like, wow, that perfectly summarizes what the UN's trying to do. They want to take away the earth and God's design and the institutions therein and rebuild it in man's image. So I start photographing and taking pictures of this art. The escort loses her mind, runs up to me. You can't film that. Put that camera down. Turn that off. Shut it off. No filming. No nothing. Loses it. We get directed out of the building. Later on, we finally found the press room and we're able to get some good interactions there. But I tell you what, Ryan, there was no more than 5, 6, 10 members of the press in the press room out of multiple hundreds. Somehow, a lucky few of us were able to find our way there. But there's so many stories I could tell, and that was just one of them. But the overall trend, the overall experience was complete lockdown on journalism. We talked to another lady from a foreign country. She said she did attempt to interview one of the UN youth delegates. UN police removed her from the premises and said you can't conduct an interview. It was total lockdown. They didn't want journalists anywhere near what was going on. And I'll tell you what, though, Ryan, the one thing they were very helpful with was we asked where the UN meditation room is, because they have a meditation room and it's got like this altar and the light shines down on it. And we wanted to go in.
I've got the artwork up on the screen, by the way, in case anyone is curious. It definitely comes with a certain air of weirdness.
Yes. And it's totally emblematic of what the UN believes, right? Rebuilding the world and man doing it and the UN being at the top of it all. And it's very interesting. So we asked if we could find this meditation room because we wanted to get some footage and some B-roll. And they were very interested in helping us with that. They're like, we have meditation materials we can give you. We've got apps that will help you meditate at home. We'll teach you how to pray and meditate in ways that are advantageous. I mean, they were very interested in that. Where's the press room? That was kind of an annoying question. But once we started talking about the meditation room and that, they were all in on sharing that and how we could better learn to meditate. So it was anti-journalism. It was pro-UN agenda. And also, just wrapping up on this, I grabbed one of these for illustration's sake. All of the members of the press were wearing this. This is the UN SDG Sustainable Development Goals pin. It's a little Fruit Loop, basically, and all of the colors represent one of the 17 goals. And all of the little journalists wear this pin on their jackets so that when they walk up to, a member of the UN delegation or whatever, they know, hey, this guy's going to ask me some easy questions. We weren't wearing the pin. Next time, I think we're going to wear the pin just so we can get some credibility. But everyone was wearing that. So it's really the lapdog media, not the watchdog media. They will sit on command. They'll roll over for a treat. They'll bark on command from occasion for dramatics sake. But they never dig up a story or sniff out a scandal or anything like that. So that's what we were dealing with. And luckily, we were able to get some good footage and some good interviews because we tried to be actual journalists and push the limits and go and ask people questions and, not be rude, but be forthright and assertive. And we were able to get some good content. So that's over at thenewamerican.com and people can see those videos. And we'll also have some more articles getting really into depth about what I just talked about regarding the information crisis coming out in October. So
good. Well, and that's I was going to say that was my last thing. I'll make sure, folks, that we include all of that in the show notes, the New American, the articles they've published, and then you know where to go back to and get them. But heck, that was more than I bargained for. I just wanted to know about your escorts, but I didn't know that you literally almost got arrested and deported, or whatever it
Yeah.
is that they're going to do to you there. Oh boy, that's there you go. Well, I mean that, I don't think there's anywhere else to go on this except down a rabbit hole of one design or the other. But I mean, really, the
Mhm.
top line for me on this is, again, what we said. Welcome to the enacting, the enforcement
Yeah.
arm, the whatever you want to call it. You were worried about the globalists coming for misinformation, disinformation, how these sustainable development goals and different things come back around, how it goes into the digital age. This is it. This gives you a nice big preview into what's coming. And I do appreciate that at least a Trump presidency threatens it. Although now I have a whole new thing to worry about: the fact that they're going to let us win and let us get comfortable.
Mhm.
That's quite dangerous. Well, I tell you what. On that note, before we wrap up here today, let me just get your reaction to one thing from this week.
Yeah.
Did you get a chance? Did you watch? I'm assuming the vice
Mhm.
presidential debate.
I did. Yeah.
You did. What were
Yes.
your? Let me just get your reaction as thoughts to that, because again, this is we. If I have another question about the UN, which I have a whole page full, we're buckle up for another hour, and we don't have that. So, let me get your thoughts. VP debate. What did you think of the dynamics there? And then I got a couple questions specific from there. Your top lines.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, JD Vance won, no doubt about that. He was articulate. He trapped Walls. Walls was completely, weak and desperate from what I could tell. Dodged all the questions. JD would maybe make a comment and then, circle back to the question. I felt like he answered all of them. One of my first observations is I'm sick of everyone calling it, myself included. I do this as well, a debate. It's really two simultaneous interviews that are taking place at one time. They really don't debate at all, which I think is unfortunate. They'll talk about a topic, but they don't cross-examine each other. They don't get to poke at each other's statements. It's just, hey, what's your opinion on immigration? You have 60 seconds. 60 seconds passes. All right, now what's your take? 60-second passes. Next topic. So I think that could really use a lot of reform,
Mhm.
just my opinion. But I think JD Vance did a great job. Tim Walz really, in my opinion, hid the radicalness of the administration and their true policies better than I thought he would. I thought he was really
Yeah.
trying to get closer to Trump and Vance. And particularly Vance, he kept saying, I agree with you, but, and then he would kind of, add his own little flavor to an issue.
Yeah.
So I think that what Tim Walz, my personal opinion, was doing was he was doing his job. He was, trying to debate and advocate for Kamala, but he was making sure his one national spotlight, his VP debate, because I don't think he's going to be the next vice president. His one blip in American history on the national presidential scale didn't make him look like a total communist dirtbag. So he tried to kind of lean on the moderate side while still pushing in the
Mhm.
necessary points that the campaign wanted him to spew out. But I think that this gave people a great opportunity to get to know JD Vance more in particular. I think he did a super job. And I was just encouraged by the wisdom of Donald Trump in picking somebody like Vance. I was skeptical at the beginning. I didn't dislike him, but I
Mhm.
was just skeptical. Is this the best choice or not? I recognize now that everything we liked about Mike Pence, JD Vance has that on steroids. And all the things we dislike about Mike Pence, JD Vance does not naturally have those qualities. I think he's everything good that offsets Trump while everything good that complements Trump. And I was very encouraged by that. His articulation, his empathy. I also really liked how he would talk to Tim Walz. He introduced his
Yeah.
wife to Tim Walz and Tim Walz's wife. I think JD Vance is going to be a diplomat for the United States in
Yeah.
ways Donald Trump cannot be. Not because he's a bad person, just because it's not his character and who he is. I think JD Vance can really be the soft sale guy for the America First agenda. And I was really encouraged by that.
Yeah, I think for those of us, and again, he wasn't my top choice either, or who I expected, quite frankly.
Hmm.
But I did know him as a very intellectual and yet a good practical, but a more than that, representing the intellectual and practical side simultaneously of conservatism. I thought he was a very good
Yes.
messenger for conservatism, a very good communicator. To see that get displayed, what I got most excited about is the future of the Republican Party. Because, I love Donald Trump. I love him for his own reasons. I also have a practical reason why I support Donald Trump. And a lot of it has to do with right now. But I think what I got most excited about is watching this Veep debate this week gave me, I feel like, a glimpse at, oh my gosh, this is the future of the Republican Party. And this is a good future. Right now, we're in the middle of a battle, but that got me really excited. And I agree with you. I think that Tim Walz used his opportunity to not be too extreme, because I think this is the only one he's going to get. But I also think that JD Vance used his opportunity to come across very normally. I mean, that's the one thing, the thing that they say about, oh, he's weird. JD Vance is so weird. I mean, if that's literally all they're going to hear, then guess what? You going on CBS. I think that I should say this. I think that with the crowd that's going to watch, they're either super Trumpers. So you got nothing. JD Vance has nothing to lose, or the rest of the CBS crowd that would be inclined to turn it on. Tim Walz has way more to lose than JD Vance does. They already think he's a freak. So if he comes on and just behaves like a totally normal dude who you'd want to hang out with, if he took his tie off and, go grab a bite to eat or something, and Tim Walz just kind of went all over the place, I think that was quite possibly very devastating. Now, again, we never see the real polling. All we ever see is public polling, which is intended to shape public opinion, not reflect public opinion. The internal polls, which I would love to see from both campaigns, I'm really curious what happened from that. But I was excited, not just because 2024, JD Vance, Make America Great Again, beat Harris Waltz. I looked at this and saw 2028 and beyond, and got really excited at the prospects of who is potentially leading with that kind of credibility the national conservative movement moving forward. That's a very interesting thing to me, because I would tend to say, and you tell me if you think I'm wrong, I think that the weakest parts of JD Vance's just masterful performance this week, the weakest parts are when he tried to defend Donald Trump's policies, which, to be fair, I think that Trump is trying to play too much to the middle on some things, and he should just ramrod through it. He does it on other stuff, but he does it on things he's comfortable. You talk about tariffs, I still haven't watched it, but Trump sitting down with Dave Ramsey this week for an interview, lecturing Dave Ramsey on why tariffs are amazing. What a great time to be alive, people. Donald Trump lecturing Dave Ramsey on what America did pre-1890 with tariffs is just, it makes me so excited. But when he doesn't have the strong opinion, like on the life issue, Donald Trump, he's probably following along with what people are telling him to do. And we know the political class are hacks. So hopefully he doesn't listen to, but I heard JD Vance try to defend a few of those positions. And look, there's just not much you can say. You want to move on. I'm not here to try to hash it out. And I know that you people, these other three I'm arguing with, want to get me into the details, and I'm not going to do that. That was about the weakest thing I saw. And I wouldn't even describe it as weak. It just wasn't as full-throated as when you could tell, holy cow, this is what JD Vance believes, and it's coming out like a fire-breathing dragon. So I see that, and I get encouraged and excited that when we get to see full-throated JD Vance, which I hope and pray is at the end, not of a UN catastrophe, a UN-induced catastrophe, but at the end of the 2024, or I should say the end of the 2025 presidential term, that JD Vance is going to be exciting and going to surround himself with even newer, exciting people. I think it's very interesting. So that was my takeaway. We hadn't talked about it, so I wanted to make sure on Caucus we got an opportunity to. But yeah, that was that. Well,
I agree.
Andrew, I'm glad that you all didn't get arrested by the United Nations tassel police. That would have been a terrible thing.
Mm-hmm. That was a good thing. Yep, we survived.
It was a good thing. Remind folks again where they can find you, and also where they can find the reporting on all of this as it's coming out. You said it a couple times, but just wrap it up in a nice little bow for us. One more.
I'm on X, Andrew1Muller, and then I'm also on libertysentinel.org. That's liberty, SENTINEL.org, and thenewamerican.com. You can find all of the coverage there, and it'll be coming out over the coming weeks as well.
Very good. Andrew, thanks for joining me today. Folks, thanks for being with us. Again, make sure you head on over. And not the countdown. Don't head there. Head on over to unauthorizedcaucus.com. Sign up there if you haven't yet. You'll make sure and get the podcast link tomorrow, the video, the audio podcast, both, and also, most importantly, the show notes, which I have several links that will be coming forward with lots more video and written content from the dynamic duo, Alex Newman and Andrew Muller, who braved the tassel police at the United Nations headquarters in New York just to bring you the truth of what's happening. And then also, while you're doing that, go on over to trexinc.com, buy some sweet stuff. They got great mugs, great hoodies. We're getting into the fall season. You need to, make sure this part of your wardrobe is outfitted correctly. trexinc.com. Use the promo code Caucus30 for a big discount, and to thank them for sponsoring this program. Couldn't do it without them. But that's it. That's all we've got today. So make sure, I think Mason will be back with us next week, but if in case he's not, we'll see. Maybe we can drag Andrew into another whole hour on the UN. It sounds like we could do at least 4 to 5. So we'll see what happens. But until then, folks, hope you have a good week, everyone. And we will talk to you all next Thursday at noon. It'll be caucus time. Thank you, Andrew. We appreciate your work.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. It's always a pleasure.
All right. Have a good week, everyone.